Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the 2020 CSPC conference panel interviews. We have the honor of having Mr. Douglas Bliss and Natalka Cmoc with us for this year's Canadian Science Policy Conference series. I also just want to acknowledge, even though we are joining you virtually, we want to be acknowledging the land we are sitting on. So I'm joining you from the land of the Lekwungen people in Victoria. Doug is joining us from Moncton, traditional territory of Mi'kmaq. And Natalka is joining us from Ottawa, the unceded territory of Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. So we extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people for their valuable past and present contributions to this land. So without further ado, my name is Noushin Nabavi, and I'm a Canadian Science Policy Fellow at the BC Ministry of Health. I'm also a volunteer for the program committee of the Canadian Science Policy Centre, and it's my absolute pleasure to sit with Natalka and Doug for the interview series. Okay, so I'll start with Natalka. Natalka, thank you for joining us. Natalka is a Director General of Science Policy Development with the Science and Parliamentary Infrastructure Branch of Government of Canada. And Doug Bliss is the Science Director of the Gulf region with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and has been leading the science planning for the Atlantic Science Enterprise Centers, ASEC. So Natalka, you started in your role recently as the Director General this year. Can you tell us a little bit more about your position and why it was established?
Oh, I'm happy to. Thank you for having us. It's a very exciting topic and panel that we're going to be promoting. I am the Director General for Science and Policy with an initiative that, as you mentioned, with Public Service Procurement Canada, and it's part of renewal of a federal science strategy overall that the government had announced in 2017, and it's really in a nutshell about how can we position federal science to prepare for the future, and that includes, of course, all of the elements to enable science, would include sort of the laboratories aspect of that. So it's trying to take a more innovative approach to science. It's making sure that our scientists are supportive and are working in facilities that are innovative and are meeting and agile to meet any kind of, and be able to pivot their science work as urgent priorities come about. So that, of course, includes working with Indigenous communities to really emphasize Indigenous science as a partner in all of this as well. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you for being here. That's great. And I'll move on to Doug. Your role is also really interesting, working with the science branch of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So what exactly does this role entail? And can you tell us more about Atlantic Science Enterprise Center?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Noushin, and good day, everyone. So first of all, I begin and thank you for making that acknowledgement for the Mi'kmaq peoples. I'll just extend that myself as well and say I'm currently sitting in the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Wolastoqey peoples, who first started their relationship with the British Crown under the Peace and Friendship Treaties of the 1700s. I have a great job. Science Director in Fisheries and Oceans mean I have a team, a large team of people, and we do some really interesting things. But if I was to characterize it in, a couple sentences, we measure and count fish, and we monitor the ocean and coastal ecosystems for ecosystem health, as well as doing things like fisheries, monitoring fisheries, or fish disease, I should say. And we do this, we work in the field, we work on ships, we use remote sensing, we have, and more particular to the Atlantic Science Enterprise Center, we have high-tech labs that do genomics and, lots of other things. So, but let me just turn a little bit to the Atlantic Science Enterprise Center itself. A concept that really just started in 2016. Before the federal government, had announced in 2018 the intent to renew federal science infrastructure across the country. And, our intent with establishing the Atlantic Science Enterprise Center, and by the way, at the same time, we established a similar center in Vancouver at one of our facilities, which was formerly known as the West Vancouver Labs, now known as the Pacific Science Enterprise Center. Both of these facilities were in older buildings, if you will, that although the buildings were in need of upgrade, our interest was establishing extensive science collaboration with external partners outside of the federal government. And so we had been working on that for a couple of years before the infrastructure renewal sort of program came into place. So fortunately, we're in a very good place now where, we get to think about the science of the future. We think about collaborations, with universities, with First Nations, with lots of other private partners. And we also get to think about having a new facility with the most modern, equipment available. So it's a very exciting time for us in the Atlantic Science Enterprise Center.
That's great. So I guess you bring me to the next question. I'll pose this to both of you. So what do you see as some of the key learnings that the federal government has had when building relationships with Indigenous people, communities, and scientists? And I guess, has the pandemic changed any of those learnings?
So who gets to go first? Me?
Confused.
Well, I'll just lead off and then I'll turn it over to Doug, of course. I think that, well, first we need to acknowledge the contribution of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis Nation is a long-standing history, of course, in contributing to science. And we're continuing to learn. And I think it's actually more and more important that we continue to do that. And part of what's going to be coming out of the panel as well. So we should always be aiming to do better. So, I mean, the history is something we do absolutely acknowledge. I think that we all recognize that for a long time, it has been not so much a relationship of doing research with, but it was a research on, for example, these communities, and not enough of acknowledgement of their contribution and sort of coming back to that community and acknowledging their contribution. And a lot has happened since then, and we're doing active work to do better at that. And that's, I think, what our panelists are going to bring up as well, how we can always improve and do better and make sure that collaboration is strong. So yes, I'm excited about some of the topics and that they're going to be raising with us.
We're looking forward to your panel for sure. Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, Doug?
And I think, yeah, just to add on to what Natalka was mentioning, I've been in the science field for a while, and I think, I could summarize that, whether you're working with First Nations or local communities or anyone else, every collaboration always begins with building a relationship. So for us, job number one is building the relationship with Indigenous peoples and First Nations. And these things take time. So, one of the things that we have learned, over time is that unless you know somebody, and particularly if you're working with First Nations communities or local communities, small towns or whatever the case may be, people value getting to know someone before you get down to the business at hand or sharing knowledge or working together. So we always try to start the conversation to getting to know each other first, before we move on to the next steps. And I think that's why, scientific, science itself is built upon that concept. That's why scientific conferences are so important to scientists. because they have to get to know their colleagues before they can enter in a collaboration. And so we really, I think, we're trying to extend that concept that we've learned over, literally the decades or longer, to say, it's actually very simple. You have to get to know each other first, and probably at an individual level, and then you can start in a meaningful way to start to, I think what we are going to be talking about, braiding knowledge systems or sharing information. So yeah, I think it starts, partnerships and collaborations start with a relationship. Thank you. Yeah.
That's great. Yes, yes. And what about the Indigenous knowledge system? So we've been traditionally talking about incorporating the knowledge system into our knowledge, so integrating and including Indigenous knowledge. How are you and your teams at your respective organizations advancing this concept? So how does it relate to and I guess also how does it relate to the panel that's coming up at the Canadian Science Policy Conference?
Yes, so I think that's you hit it right on the focus point too. It's a braiding of knowledge systems, and so it's your Western science, but it's it's the braiding with the knowledge system of Indigenous science, really, and it's that coming together to inform decision making together. So you need all knowledge systems to be able to really inform, to really make improvements in things like climate change, for example. But I'm even talking about simple things that you hear some of the stories, thinking from the laboratory's perspective, site selection. So you'll hear anecdotal stories of where a lab is positioned, and you'll hear the community say, "Don't build there. It's not a good place to build." And so even from that perspective of listening to the community, to be able to learn the land keepers how and where you position, and really thinking about labs differently as well. So it's not just inside a building, it's also the external aspects of course, is a very important component here. And looking at things, and one of our speakers will be talking a little bit about something called a living lab, for example, right? It's that incorporating the knowledge that the community has into the observation, into data collection, and bringing that together, which will be a much more enriched body of knowledge by working together, which is what Doug can elaborate on in his field, but you can speak on that on any field across, whether it's health, climate, you name it. It will apply in any area that you can mention in the federal science sphere.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I hear a lot of integration, and yeah, thank you. Yeah, Doug, go ahead.
And those are a lot of great points. And maybe what I just maybe add to some of those points is although it seems like a hugely difficult task, I think if we collectively sort of sit down and think about it, it shouldn't be, right? Because knowledge systems all have the same foundation. It's you collect information somehow, you process it somehow, and then you retain it and communicate it somehow. And so if we look at those three elements, it's just that Indigenous knowledge does that in a different way than we do in sort of Western science knowledge. It's all the same objective in terms of gathering information and really, trying to understand the world and how it works. I think I know to many of my scientists, for example, it sounds, seems like a very, very daunting task, but, it doesn't have to be, because I'll refer back to talking about relationships. You build a relationship and you start, I think it really starts, very organically about, how you take those first steps, realizing is all we're talking about is really different ways of looking at the world, but with the same objective. So when I think about what the panel is going to be considering, I would hope they could provide all of us, I think, on some advice on how you take those first steps and then the steps after that to sort of continue on that journey. for us, admittedly, I would say that we're at the beginning of the journey, and we're interested in learning at how to do it, recognizing that I think we all have the same objectives. We're just trying to figure out how one should go about doing this in the best way.
Mm-hmm. And I guess with the added option of having the Canadian Science Policy Conference going completely virtual this year, we're going to have an opportunity to reach a wider audience, and that's really exciting. And I guess what would you be looking forward to with this online platform and having your voice and your panelists' voice being heard wider?
Well, I think the panel itself is representing all parts of Canada, and each panelist will be coming forward with multiple perspectives, right? Their Indigenous communities' perspective, but also whether they're an academic. So Dr. Ottman will talk about the great work that she's doing as the Vice Provost for Indigenous involvement in the university level. And so we have a lot to learn even from how academic institutions are transforming as well on the same topics. And it's just fascinating, right? Taking science in a broader term of knowledge, right? We also will have Ms. Melody Lapine, who will talk to us specifically about the work that she does from her community. So she's the director for the intergovernment relations, and so she will give us very clear insight there, and she works very closely with elders on that knowledge base. But she's also studying herself to complete her, I believe it's her Master's of Science. So she's integrating that personally as well, not just giving us advice from that personal perspective, which I think will be very exciting. And Keith Cmoc is a scientist that brings in that academic perspective from the North, but also now working, I believe it's the National Research Council, and he's developing a whole program and be able to speak about that. But he has very real experience of working in the North and from his community perspective as well. So I think any topic we will be discussing, and we'll let the topics move and adjust as the panelists end up taking it. But I think any topic that even comes from the questions from the audience, and I hope there'll be lots of questions from the audience, that they're going to bring in those various perspectives. And then I failed to mention also, of course, David Fortin, who is bringing the architecture perspective. So he's a Métis architect and dean of the MacEwan Architecture School, but he teaches his architecture students on how to engage on design with the community. So he teaches architect students that you are designing, you are building with the community. It's not for the community. And that's a very important perspective, because even as we think about the federal science infrastructure, or even federal science as a science objective, it's collective, right? It is, how do you do that in a participatory way? And that's something, that's an important transition mark. And of course, our last panelist is Fred Rona, and he worked in the Academic Institute. I believe he worked with Doug, actually, and so he's an aquatic scientist. But I'll let him describe it, because it's a water expertise. But he has also a lot of very direct experience as chief scientist from his time with Alberta, that he just recently retired from, and worked on a couple of very key initiatives very closely with the Indigenous communities in Alberta, including monitoring, observation, and so on. So I think that's going to be a very exciting panel that we'll all collectively be able to learn from. In terms of your question, though, sorry, I didn't answer your question. And so what I'm excited about it being a virtual panel is that it will, I believe, attract a much wider audience to participate. The panelists, where you're able to attract panelists from all over that you might not have been able to. And so I think it's going to be a very a new way of doing things. And who knows, maybe in the future, this is something that will be maintained. And I hope so.
That's really exciting. Looks like your panel is very diverse and coming from all over Canada. So this is a great platform to incorporate everyone and have everyone be in the same place. Yeah. So Doug, how do you see that?
Well, I just really echo everything that Natalka has said. It's, I think the only thing I guess I would emphasize beyond having, absolutely fantastic panel members, of which, I know a few of them actually. Keith worked for me at one point in time in his career. Is really, it's kind of interesting during this pandemic. We've all been involved in various, conferences, and I've been fortunate enough to be involved in multi-nation kind of meetings and things like this. And it really is a technology, if we use it successfully, that can bring people globally together in terms of having a conversation about things. So it's not just who can afford to travel to go to a conference. It really can bring in people from, I say internationally, globally, which is, I think it's real power. And the only thing I would say, and not only is that good in terms of potentially having a global reach and a global discussion, is it's good for the planet because people aren't jumping in airplanes and flying all over the place. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. More accessible, and I hope, we're going to have a better turnout and lots of discussions to follow. So we definitely look forward to hearing both your panels at the virtual CSPC conference. And thank you so much for joining us today. And look forward to seeing you from November 16th to 20th virtually.
Yes, my pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.